Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you watch my videos, you know that I don't usually do a video on Saturday, but to be honest, the news at the moment is just lit. The amount of things going on in South Africa, specifically because of the G20 and everything is going on with Donald Trump. The news is just like off the charts, but reward me for a video on a Saturday. Subscribe to the channel, share the video with your friends, help the video go viral, and if you really want to support the work that I'm doing here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So let's start off with the first news story, and this is around the G20 leadership, specifically around whether or not Donald Trump or the US are sending a delegate to the G20. Now, news came out that Donald Trump was sending a delegation. Now, this news was communicated by Cyril Ramaphosa. I communicated that in a video yesterday. But I did make commentary that I feel many people just didn't listen to. And that is, I did use the phrase, they're sending junior members of staff. Now, apparently some individuals watched other people's videos and said, whoa, it's not true, they're not sending anybody. But I need to qualify this and say they did say they were sending somebody. But let's talk about it, what actually went on. So apparently, as you know, the US said they were going to boycott the G20. Now, the day before the summit, the US said that they would be sending an individual, a Mark Dillard. Now, Mark Dillard's actually in the ambassadorial office. Now, he did this because Cyril Ramaphosa said that they would symbolically hand over the reins, as I said in my video yesterday, to the G20 at the end of the summit to an empty chair. An allusion to basically the US wasn't there and let's try and embarrass them. So according to the US, they were going to attend just the closing ceremony, and it would be to receive the G20. Now, this individual, very low-ranking individual, very low-ranking envoy, is not at the same level as, say, an ambassador or a secretary of state, which is typically used to take over the G20's leadership. So that in itself is kind of like, well, we're sending somebody, but it's like the janitor. Now, Cyril responded and said, you can't hand the G20 over to a junior embassy official. He said that this was insulting and poor form. Even the DA's leader, John Steenhuisen, unexpectedly backed Cyril Ramaphosa on this, saying the US is being disrespectful in terms of its global protocol. But behind the scenes, many of South Africa's diplomats were saying the only reason that this was being done was to delegitimize the summit, to disrupt the leaders' declaration, and to weaken South Africa's presidency. It's the usual kind of conspiracy theory nut jobs. Now, Cyril did give an address in relation to this, and he said the US were sending individuals, and in response to this, the White House suggested that Cyril was, and I quote, running his mouth. And during that press conference, they reiterated that the US is not participating in the G20 discussions, and they were only going to intend informally to receive the chair. Now, you can actually watch both sides' responses to this right here.
We have received notice from the United States, a notice which we are still in discussions with them over, about a change of mind about participating in one shape, form, or other in the summit. So the discussions are still ongoing. This comes really at the late hour before the summit begins. And so therefore we do need to engage in those types of discussions to see how practical it is and what it finally really means.
The United States is not participating in official talks at the G20 in South Africa. I saw the South African president running his mouth a little bit against the United States and the president of the United States earlier today, and that language is not appreciated by the president or his team. The ambassador or the representative of the embassy in South Africa is simply there to recognize that the United States will be the host of the G20. They are receiving that send-off at the end of the event. They are not there to participate in official talks, despite what the South African president is falsely claiming.
Now, the problem really came in on whether or not the US could send a junior diplomat at the last minute to receive this chair. Now, South Africa responded to the United States and said, you can't just waltz in at the last minute and demand the declaration being downgraded and to give the G20 over to a junior official. Ramaphosa yet again used the line that said, we will not be bullied. He said that there should be no one nation who can bully another. He said, we are all equal. Now, that is very important because what he's effectively saying is that the US, in terms of its global authority, uses that global might to dominate lower or smaller nations. And he doesn't like that because he's getting picked on. So stop bullying him. Unsurprisingly, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, came out and said that they regret the US's absence, but we cannot stop because of it. And he said that they need to push the G20 ahead with focuses on climate financing, debt reform, and multilateral cooperation. He predicts that the US will rejoin next year. So this is only a 1-year kind of hiatus, and it's because of South Africa that they're not coming. And he says that they will rejoin in 2026 when they host the event. So according to him, America's just boycotting as a degree of political theater, and it's not a structural withdrawal. It's South Africa. They don't want to interact with South Africa. Now, so far, what's actually gone on in the event has been quite interesting, because so far, there are suggestions that Russia and Ukraine may be on the verge of a peace deal, with Ukraine having to cede territory to Russia. But the UN Secretary General, who, if you know who that is, it's another communist and a socialist. I'm afraid, look it up, you'll see for yourself. Well, he said that there should be no deal because, according to him, Ukraine's territorial integrity must be respected. Now, it's always interesting to note these globalist-type individuals that always seem to have an opinion on everything, even though they're not on the front lines and they're not financing these events. So they really have nothing to lose, but everything to kind of give an opinion on. Now, according to the UN Secretary General, he said that the US-backed plan was forcing Ukraine to give up Crimea and the Donbass, and this was in violation of international law, as if the only law that goes around the world and has any impact is international law, when international law is kind of toothless because it's not their country. They're making declarations on a country they don't live in. They don't have to fight the war. They're not the ones dying, but they're the ones with the big mouth. But the reason that this is interesting is because this is all being said in South Africa. South Africa is allied to Russia. They have yet to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the UN Secretary General, the socialist that he is, has praised South Africa's G20 theme. And he says that Africa must be the center of it. In other words, Africa needs to kind of, even though South Africa is the only African member, remember they've got lots of observers, like 45 members that are observers from different nations, mostly Africa. But they're saying Africa must be the central focus of the G20, specifically around global clean energy, global financing reform, and development financing. And he called Africa a double victim, being exploited under colonialism and then excluded when global institutions were created. And he calls for African representation in the UN Security Council, the IMF and the World Bank, and G20 permanent agenda status. This is very interesting, specifically around the Security Council, because South Africa doesn't have, or any African country doesn't have, large-scale investment in arms. They don't have large security forces. None of them are nuclear nations. Like, what are they contributing to this? I don't know. But in a surprise move, the US has pledged $4.6 billion to a global fund for HIV, TB, and malaria. Now, this money will be the single largest contribution globally to these medical issues. Now, this is surprising because at the start of the year, Trump literally got rid of all the global grants, and now they appear to be making a comeback, all at a time when the G20 is being run the US is kind of looking a little bit foolish by not being there. And now they're like, hey, guys, we got some money. We'll give you money to TB, HIV, and malaria. You really need that money. Aren't we great? And so this signals that the Trump administration politically is boycotting South Africa, but they still need to somehow maintain their global leadership, the health of their global leadership. And the way that they're doing that is, well, through grants for medical issues. Now, Trevor Manuel had picked up on the idea of this whole global debt issue, specifically on how it works in Africa. And he said that Africa loses $89 billion a year in debt service, and they lose $88 billion a year in illicit financial flows. For those of you who don't know what that means, well, it was money laundering, probably going to Dubai, maybe a Zuma sum, maybe, you know how it goes in many African countries. Now, he suggested that only 4 African countries have ever tried the G20 debt restructuring system, but none of them have ever been successful. And he says that the IMF's government is skewed. Apparently, Africa only has a 5% vote, but 40% of IMF loan exposure. But I don't know if this really means what he thinks it means, because what he's effectively trying to say is that Africa should have a bigger say on what goes on in the IMF because it's got the majority of the loans. But arguably, Africa shouldn't have a big say in what's going on in the IMF because they have the majority of the loans. In other words, they can't look over their own finances. So why would you give them big voting powers and big exposures in the way the IMF is run when they're the ones in debt? Now, Trevor Manuel was part of a panel, and as part of that panel, they discussed the sovereign debt mechanisms of Africa, climate disaster clauses, and the global SDR reform. So basically, they discussed all the green agenda and the UN type stuff, and basically how Africa is being screwed in terms of having to borrow for these stupid ideas. Now, the whole idea behind this is that what they're saying is that the developmental system put in place by the West is basically causing Africa to be priced out because Africa can't afford it. And I can actually get on board with that. There's a lot of developmental rubbish in the West that Africa is having to finance for itself, but we're not at that stage. We're not economically and politically advanced enough to deal with Western solutions, if you want to call them that. So I'm actually in agreement with that, and we should probably get rid of that and scrap it. But then it would directly conflict with all the globalist bull rubbish, which apparently Cyril tells us frequently that he loves. But in any case, let's actually get onto the main story of today, because there is one segment, one story, which I just thought was delicious. I read it, I smiled, I had a feel-good thing inside, and I must admit I had a good Friday evening because of it. And that is the news that Naledi Pandor, yep, remember Naledi Pandor, the Islamist? Well, she's received an email from the US consulate revoking her US visa. No explanation provided, and apparently she must reapply if she ever wants to return to the US, probably going to get denied. Now, Pandor is not a random private citizen because, as you know, she was a former foreign minister of South Africa, and she was the woman who led the South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the ICJ. And she is the central figure in the global pro-Palestinian movement. Now, Pando herself says that the cancellation of her visa was like a political message, and it was a form of diplomatic escalation between, well, her and her departments, the way that she runs them, specifically in how she's recently, in very recent times, kind of sided with the UN special rapporteur, an Islamist supporter of her own. And you will know she recently had her at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, where they basically talked about how terrible Gaza and the US and Israel was, and what. Now, it was inevitable that many individuals would say the US was going to come down on her at one point, and many of the UN suggestions around sanctions and around the anti-Semitic laws, a lot of them focused on her. She was the central figure in a lot of the drama. And you know, when you listen to her talk in the United States, it wasn't surprising to understand why. Like, have a watch of this.
Fourth, and I'm not causing trouble here, but armed struggle may become a necessity. I said recently in America that we as Muslims, we are a peace-loving people, but we are permitted to engage in jihad when necessary. And we must remember this.
Now, more interestingly enough is her interaction with the UN Special Reporter. That's Francesca Albanese, for those of you who don't know who she is. Well, she recently gave an address where she effectively said that really she wasn't comfortable with the ceasefire in Gaza. Now, remember, according to her, there's genocide occurring there. We must stop it at all costs, and these people need to have food and stop the war. And then when Trump actually agreed a ceasefire, she said, well, that's not very good, because what it's going to do is allow Israel to be in a comfort zone, and there might be peace now. And she says, well, that's not what they want. They want to stop the genocide, but they don't want to stop the war. And in fact, you can actually see her address on this yourself right here.
Yes, basically my question is, what do you want that the EU do now, if it's enough, if it is enough, in your opinion, what has been proposed by the European Commission in terms of sanction and suspension of the association agreement? And the second one is, what do you expect? Because given also the current political situation, do you think it's likely that something will really happen? Thank you.
I think that I can answer in one breath what I think of the Trump plan and the last UN Security Council resolution, because one gave birth to the other. And I'm very concerned. I'm still processing the disappointment for what has been just approved within the August institution that is the United Nations. And I do believe, let me be very frank, that besides the optimism of thinking that there will be a ceasefire, there has not been a day of ceasefire since it was proclaimed. I see that the ceasefire that was proclaimed nearly 2 months ago, or a little less than that, was a way to silence those who were asking to stop the genocide, the occupation and the apartheid, to stop the flotilla, to tell people taking to the street or others complaining, special rapporteurs, independent experts. There is peace now. There is peace. There is a ceasefire. There's not been a ceasefire for the Palestinians, the people to whom a ceasefire had to be meaningful for, right? So ceasefire has become a word to make people in this part of the world or in this institution and others similar content that they can continue being indifferent to the suffering of the people, it's Palestinians or others in the world. We won't let them rest in their comfort zone.
Now, it should come as no surprise that if these are your friends, that Pandor eventually was going to get her visa revoked to the US. You have her in one respect basically saying that jihad is okay, and in another respect, her friends, the people she hangs out with, talks down against the US and basically says we should continue a war. So inevitably, who wants her there? I mean, clearly the US are going to retaliate, and it was only a matter of time. Now, Pandor says that as far as she's concerned, the reason for her visa being blocked was because of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies member, Mr. Lawrence. According to her, this individual has been lobbying the US to, well, get her sanctioned. And so it's the Jews' fault. Yeah, I mean, it's always the bloody Jews' fault. You see, this is why she was sanctioned. Now, letters have allegedly been sent to US authorities accusing Pandor of aligning with Iran, Qatar, and pro-Palestinian blocs. I don't know, like Hamas, which we have a headquarters for in Cape Town. So you have to look at this and go, it wasn't one individual, one Jew that got you blocked from the US. It was your own actions. We all saw that it was going to come. You kept cozying up with Iran when the US was fighting a war against it. You kept saying the US was this terrible entity for blowing up Iran's nuclear ambitions. You kept saying Israel should be wiped off the face of the planet, and look at these terrible people. It was inevitable that the US would eventually retaliate. And how she somehow thinks that it's now everybody else's fault, I really don't know. But the reality is, Pandor is a very unsavory individual with many questionable positions when it comes to her. Now, you have to understand that her successor was Ronald Lamola. And Ronald Lamola also is now showing he ain't the brightest smarty in the smarty box. In fact, you can actually see an interview he did with CNN. In fact, have a watch.
So you said you didn't know that it was coming. You've made these, interim declarations about them being allowed to stay for a certain period. Israel has said that a third country approved this transportation, but didn't say which country. Was it South Africa? I mean, did you approve this? I think you said that you didn't know about it.
No, we didn't approve any. We don't have any agreement with Israel to depopulate or to remove people from Gaza to South Africa, because that will go against a resolution that we support of a two-state solution, a resolution of the United Nations that Palestinians and the Israelis must live side by side in the Gaza Strip with the Palestinian authorities, and also in Jerusalem, with East Jerusalem as its capital. So there is no way we can agree to such an arrangement, because it will go against that resolution of the United Nations. And we will also not accept any further flights of this nature, just because it is against that resolution of the United Nations that there must be a two-state solution of, as I've already mentioned.
Now, the reason I mention this is because this is a guy who advocates for Israeli-Palestinian justice, right? Okay. He doesn't seem to understand that Gaza, the strip of Gaza, isn't where Jews and Israelis and Gazans live peacefully side by side. Gaza is independently run. It is arguably the Palestinian state. Now, Gaza, a completely independent entity, doesn't have any Jews or Israelis living in it because it's a separate state. So immediately he's like, he doesn't understand a thing about Gaza. The second thing is he talks about Gaza and East Jerusalem and how they must all have like a two-state solution. Again, he doesn't understand. The two-state solution with East Jerusalem as a capital pertains to the West Bank. The West Bank wants East Jerusalem as the capital of its Palestinian state, which means you have to divide East Jerusalem and allow East Jerusalem to be under the control of the West Bank. Now, that's problematic because many people share the holy sites in East Jerusalem. Now, you see, the problem was that before, East Jerusalem and the West Bank at one point in time were under Jordanian control. And it's important to understand that when in the past that land has been seized, it was never used to create a Palestinian state. It was annexed to the countries of the people who seized the land. Hence, the West Bank, also known as Judea and Samaria, was actually the West Bank of Jordan. It's the bank of land across the Jordan River to the west of main Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. That's why it was called the West Bank. It wasn't like, oh, look, we seized this land, let's create a Palestinian state. Gaza itself was annexed to Egypt. Egypt didn't put it into a Palestinian state. They literally annexed it to Egypt until they didn't want it. Now, the reason this is problematic is because there are numerous forms of difficulties with the governance of East Jerusalem and sections of Judea and Samaria. And this comes in what was defined in the Oslo Accords as areas A, B, and C, because areas C are under complete control of the Palestinian Authority, and areas A are completely under the control of Israel. Those are Jewish individuals that live there. And areas B are like kind of like co-governed, if you want to call them that. And the reason that they can't come up with this blanket definition of like just give them the state is give it to who? Hamas? Palestinian Authority? Where's the elections? Who's the elected official? What army's going to govern it? What police force are going to govern it? You can't just come up with stupid slogans and say, well, we're just going to have this two-state solution. It's not that straightforward now, is it? But the reality is when you listen to him talk, he doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. You can hear how nuanced and complicated the topic is, and yet our foreign minister, who's advocating for policy positions, he clearly doesn't understand, is articulating them on TV. He sounds like a moron. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we have in terms of our political elite in South Africa. Retards par excellence. And that is also why Pando lost a visa to the US. Because at some point in time, you just have to call bullshit and just say, you know what, we've had enough of this bullshit, no more. And in the case of Pando, it was inevitable that this would happen eventually. At least that's my opinions. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.